Well, we're going to be picking up today in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9.
Mhm.
And we're going to look at the flood proper. So we spent all that time on the first 8 verses, probably thoroughly confused everybody. But those are fun 8 verses. I'm sad to move on from them. But here we are in verse 9. I will read this. Then we're going to just discuss it. We won't read every verse of these 3 chapters, but it's important to get the beginnings.
Mhm.
These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every kind shall come into you, to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God had commanded him. We'll get to chapter 7 and an interesting little wrinkle there momentarily. But that's our opening. That's the introduction. This is when God first speaks to Noah. So we should probably begin at the beginning. Isn't that what we do? We follow the spirit of Inigo Montoya and go back to the beginning?
Back to the beginning, Vincent.
What do you think, and you don't have to answer this, Minister Joe, we'll talk about it together, but when it says Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, how do you read that?
Well, I think Noah was, well, we know from our Hebrew study, we know from the lineage of, I want to say that he's from Seth's side of the family, and reflective also of Enoch, who went before him, if I'm right in saying that. Following in that same tradition where it says that he walked with God. That's not to be taken lightly, in my opinion. That there's a distinction there that reveals that Noah is more than just some ordinary man.
Yeah, it's hearkening us back to Adam and Eve before the fall, right? And then that's reiterated with Enoch.
Yeah, and we're picking up basically the last line of chapter 4, where it says that man at that point started to call the name of the Lord.
Right.
Really reveals a character in Noah, more so than something that's extremely detailed out.
Right.
So to me, Noah was a person who stood out among his people.
Yeah, I like the words that are used of him. In Hebrew, the word righteous is zadik, which comes from the word for holy. So it means to be set apart for some special use. So when you say that Noah stood out, that's a good way to interpret it. Of the people of the earth, there was something singular about Noah. He didn't go in the way that the others went. He walked with God. I would love to have interrogated what that looked like in his day, but we're not really told. We're just told who he is. When it says blameless in his generation, I understand the translation, but the word there is tamim, which means complete, or to have all that you need. That's the word that is often translated by the Greek word perfect, the Greek word for perfect. But the sense is here that he has what he needs. So he stands apart from the people of his time. He walks with God, and he has all he needs. He's complete. So he is Zadik and he is Tamim.
There seems to be also that in further that we've read so far is that a distinction as far as violence and great wickedness. There seems to be some type of connection between him standing out as a backdrop, something to compare to,
Yeah.
to show that.
Yeah, this is always a little fun fact. So there's a group in our world today called Hamas.
Yes.
Well, this word for violence in Hebrew is Hamas.
Really?
That's what it is. It means violence or wrongdoing. Anything that brings injury or hurt to, it doesn't have to be other people, though certainly that applies, but can even be to the world.
They're considered a terrorist group. Is that correct?
Hamas is, yeah, and that's Arabic.
Oh, Arabic.
I don't know if Arabic does come from Hebrew, but way long. It's kind of the same way Spanish came from Latin, so they're related, but they're quite distant. But it's just interesting to me when I was doing Hebrew memorization, the way I remembered what Hamas meant was because of the group Hamas in our world. It is a violent group.
Doesn't actually in Arabic, it doesn't mean violence. No.
I don't know what it means in Arabic.
Okay.
Maybe it does. I don't know. But in Hebrew, Hamas, which is an H sound, but it's a guttural H, means violence. Yeah. So anyway, the earth is filled with Hamas, is what it says in Hebrew. So it's filled with destructive behaviors. And I agree with you. It would seem that if that's the way the world is walking, that would not be the way Noah is walking. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That movie that was done more recently that starred Russell Crowe as Noah picked up on this, where Noah is a bit of a pacifist. He doesn't want to kill animals, and he doesn't really believe in doing violence for violence sake, though he's not afraid to defend himself in that movie. So you might ask yourself, is that real accurate? But they definitely picked up in that movie version on the fact that Noah was out of step with his contemporaries. That somehow the ethics that were guiding his life were pretty different than the ethics that were guiding the lives of everybody else. So, yeah. And the earth is corrupt, God sees. I don't know how useful this is, but it's shachat is the word for corrupt, and it generally means a pit that you would use to trap an animal is a shachat. So the sense that I'm getting, corrupt is probably the right word, but it's deceitful. It looks like one thing, but it's another. When you set up a pit to catch a lion, which is what shachat is often used for. It's supposed to look like just the ground. And then the lion walks into it and, falls in or whatever. So it's deceptive. So it's full of Hamas, destructive behaviors, and it's deceitful. It's corrupt. It looks like one thing and turns out to be another.
Yeah.
And all flesh had done this to its ways. All their ways had become this. Shachat, like pits you would trap lions in. It's an interesting evaluation of the earth by God. Part of me wants to say, boy, not that much has changed.
Yeah, right. Well, it saw so much of the temptation in the garden with the fruit that was pleasing to the eye. It's that deception seems to be another circle of events happening here.
Yeah. And God is at a point, and you might ask yourself, why at this point he doesn't seem to think it can be redeemed, or he doesn't want to redeem it. You decide. But he's decided to make an end of all flesh. And this is the word basar that we talked about last week, to be distinguished from spirit. Mm-hmm. So he's not putting an end to all life. He's putting an end to all flesh. It's an interesting distinction. It reminds me of a passage in Hebrews where it says that God was going to, as he shook the earth in the days of Noah, he's going to shake it again. Or as he shook the earth at Mount Sinai, he's going to shake it again, and anything that is mortal will perish, and only the spirit will remain. It's interesting that is the language of this. He's not destroying everything, just the flesh. And there might be a sense of fleshliness.
Yeah, there was a sense that, where it said all that had the breath of life in it.
Yeah. And the earth is filled with Hamas because of them, destructiveness.
Mm-hmm.
So here, the word corrupt here
mm-hmm.
is
okay.
Verb form of
It's
the word shachat. The noun form means pit, but it's from that verb. And the word destroy here in verse 13 is the same word. God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways, and then he says, now I'm going to destroy them. It's the same word. That's my point.
Mm. So it's basically attributing that to God. God saying it.
I would say, and this is my opinion, I think it's a pretty informed one though, that God's judgment is almost always giving us what we've asked for. So there's a sense in which people, like in Noah's day, they're doing all this violence. Their ways are corrupt. They become deceitful. They're building pits for each other. That's essentially, I think, the nature of the picture that's being drawn. And they're trapping each other, doing all kinds of exploitative things. And God, somehow the earth wasn't being destroyed by it. Like somehow creation was still going. And the logic of the scriptures is, well, that's because God was protecting them from the worst consequences of their behavior. And essentially what the flood is God says, well, if that's what you want, I'll let you have it. And so even though it's God doing it, because when God removes the protections, that is an action. What he's allowing to come in are what they're trying desperately to bring in anyway. In many ways, the flood is an answer to the prayer of the pre-flood world. God is going to give them exactly the world they are making. And they are not going to like it. So there's a sense in which evil people get away with their wickedness for a while because God is merciful, because he's taking care of us. And so the evil doesn't have quite the effect it should have because God is still holding the waters at bay. But what happens in the flood is God takes away those hands of protection and the world becomes exactly what the humans are trying to make it. And of course, nothing survives that. So I think by using similar terms, it's not taking God off the hook. He's making a decision to allow the consequences to rush over the people. But it's still their behavior that dictates their punishment. They're filling the earth with violence, so violence comes upon them. They're digging pits, so God sends a pit for them. Their behavior is dictating the judgment. And I think it's important to recognize that in the way the words are being used. And I think the same is true today. God doesn't pick our punishments. We pick them by choosing our sins.
Yeah. But then most of our society doesn't look at it that way. They want to blame God for that.
Yeah, right. Well, it's easy to blame the idea of God for everything that goes wrong. And it's also easy to blame God for everything that goes right. Because, we give God thanks for the blessings of our lives, even though some of those blessings did not come to us by God. Some of us got them in crooked ways. Some of us got our blessings by doing things we shouldn't have done. So, we gotta be careful. You can blaspheme God in any number of ways, by giving him credit for things he didn't do and by blaming him for things he didn't do. Right. But it's true that every good and perfect gift comes from the Father. But not everything you and I think is a gift comes from God. I have actually talked with people, Minister Joe, maybe you have too, who have claimed that an affair was a gift of God to them, that they finally found someone who understood them. And they were giving God thanks. This happened in my presence more than once with more than one kind of person, where people thanked God in my presence for their affair. And believe me, that was not a gift from God.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say that we give God thanks for everything we think is a gift, we should remember the scriptures say that every good and perfect gift comes from God.
Yeah.
But that's different than everything I'm thankful for, because you might be thankful for things you shouldn't be.
Right.
Yeah. So what I'm kind of pointing out here on, and I think I've caught you off guard a little bit because we didn't talk about this in advance. But I do think there's a sense in the way that this is shaped that the consequence that God is going to send on them is very much in kind with the life that they've been living.
Yeah, I think I can sense that too. I'm tracking with you in some ways. You think of, when people do things that they often don't realize what they're asking for, but in reality, when it comes to it, you could expect that result. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, well, or that God will make sure eventually we get to see what we've chosen. Like this is what C.S. Lewis, I remember once said, that the law of reaping and sowing is absolute. And I can't tell you where he said it. It might have even just been in one of his fictional books. A character might have said it. I can't pick it out of it, but it stuck with me when I read it, that the law of reaping and sowing is absolute. And there is a sense in which you must reap what you sow. And so God doesn't, I want to insist that the way this is structured is that God hasn't picked this punishment. The people have picked this punishment. They have sown seeds, and they will reap the produce of those seeds. And that is often how God's judgment works. It's not as though God is sitting up in heaven sadistically trying to think of ways to punish us. Like any good parent, sometimes the best teacher are the consequences of your children's own behavior. But I have said this. Have you ever said, maybe I'm just mean, Minister Joe, I don't know. Have you ever said this to your kids? Like, I've had my child put down a law for their sibling that they would never want enforced for them. And so I said, if that's a rule for your sibling, I will make it a rule for you. I don't know if you've ever done that, but don't make me feel bad about myself. But the point is that sometimes, I think almost always, we pick our judgment. So it's never a matter of God sadistically trying to come up with ways to torture humans. Both the sin and its consequence were birthed in the human heart. Now, God created the world in such a way that sin will produce negative consequences. So he's on the hook for that. But I think the specific things we suffer are almost always on us, not as individuals, but as a corporate reality. And I think that's what the flood is about. Why did God punish them with such violence? Why did God punish them with water? Because of what they were doing.
Well, yeah. I mean, we talked before about water being chaos.
Water is chaos. It's lawlessness. That's what water represents. So what would you bring on the lawless? You would bring lawlessness on them. I often wish that people in our day right now who are so big on anarchy and thinking that we don't need law and order, that we don't need anybody to police us, that we can police ourselves, that's the water. And that was the world before the flood. And we saw the consequence of that life. Chaos rushes over everything. But we have many today who believe that people are inherently good and that all we need is freedom to be as good as we want to be. And if everybody had their own, I'm quoting the scriptures now, if everyone had their own well and their own fig tree, there would be no crime. And that was a false promise of the king of Assyria, which was made to the Jewish people to get them to forsake Jerusalem. And it is a false promise of the serpent. And it was the world before the flood. So many times you and I suffer something that is a direct consequence of the world we've chosen. And God's judgment is refusing to protect us from the world we have chosen to live in. And God is merciful, so he does protect us for a long time. But eventually he will bring his judgment. And what that means is he will stop protecting us from the consequences of our actions. But the specific judgments that come, I think, are related to the choices we've made. The law of reaping and sowing is absolute. Yeah, do you want to process that?
Well, no, in reality, I think that's certainly true. I mean, if the end result ultimately was going to become chaos. I really feel like that's what you're saying. So the extreme of that. I mean, even those, like you said, who want to use anarchy as a means to get their point across, in the end, I don't think they want absolute constant anarchy. They want change, but the reality is that change is not going to come forever or sustainable in that realm.
My belief is that we actually hunger and thirst for the kingdom of God when we want justice. Mm-hmm. And we recognize that the kingdoms of the earth are corrupt and we can't see any way to fix them. And so our solution is the solution of all who are born of chaos. Burn it all down and maybe we'll build something better. But what we're really hungering for is God to govern the earth. What we're really hungering for is a reestablished relationship with the Lord and Jesus to be the king of the earth. That's what we're really hungering for. And we see that human systems are irredeemable because as soon as you fix one part, another part falls apart. It's kind of like trying to keep an old house that's been let go for too long running, or an old vehicle that was just not maintained well, trying to keep it plugging along. Like we realize it can't, so we think, well, let's buy a new one. But the problem is, you can't buy a new humanity. Jesus is the only source of new humanity. And so there's no way actually to fix what's broken with us. And I think these protests are humanity waking up to that reality and realizing that it's all broken and there's no way to fix it. So the human solution is let's burn it down. In many ways, the human solution is the flood. But God gave us a different way with Jesus, a way that was not offered to the people in the days of the flood. If only we would take it, we might escape what's inevitably coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think they would receive it, and just like there are today people who are not receiving that.
Well, following Jesus comes at the cost of some things that we don't want to lose.
Yeah.
Why do you think the scriptures go into detail about the size and dimensions of the ark?
Well, some people might say that they want to be specific because there's specific design in which God uses for lots of things in the tabernacle and sort of stuff like that. And that could be something that would be interesting to compare the size of the ark to the tabernacle.
Yeah.
But the idea of specific design in size and shape, I think helps to understand the magnitude of the job itself. And
yeah,
I mean, I can't imagine
the word for ark is an interesting one
yeah.
Because it's the same consonants for the word for coffin, and it generally means a box, like the Ark of the Covenant.
Mm.
It's never used of a boat, save one time, maybe, because Moses was placed in an ark. It's the same word when he's floated on the Nile River. So that's the only example of the word here, ark, being used for a ship.
Mm-hmm.
There's another word for ship in Hebrew that would be used for a boat. So it's an interesting thing. And as detailed as this is, it's really non-specific. Because ark technically means box, and it gives you length and height and number of floors, but not a lot of shipbuilding advice. Like the ship, you want to bow, right? I mean, you want something rounded because you want it to float. None of those descriptions are here. I know you have read have you been to the Ark encounter?
The one
Yeah,
in
so you've
Kentucky.
seen that.
Oh yeah.
They've taken a lot of liberties. I mean, it's the right dimensions,
Yep.
but they have made it a boat,
Yeah.
which the word ark does not mean. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean boat. It means box. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in some other traditions, like there's another Near Eastern story of the flood, and the ark in that story is literally a cube.
Cube. Yeah.
It's a cube. Yeah, which is similar because it's an ark.
Yeah.
You know, so it's very specific though on how wide it should be, on how long it should be,
Mm-hmm.
how many floors it should be, that it should have a roof, and where the door should be placed. Very specific.
Right.
And yet so not enough information to build a boat.
Right.
If it were to be a boat.
Right. Yeah. It sounds. I've heard some people talk about it may look more like a barge type of thing, or like flat. You know, like maybe around here they had these barges for the Erie Canal.
Yeah.
It would look more like probably something like this.
Well, I'm most interested in the narrative correlations, because this is an ark that saves them.
Mm-hmm.
And then later they're to build an ark to hold the covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes the Ark of the Covenant. And there's definitely a correlation with those two words in Genesis and Exodus. The two are meant to refer to each other. And Moses is also placed in an ark. So the sense of the ark is protection, right? That's what this thing is. You're to build something in which you will be protected from the waters. Now, it's clear later on that the thing floats, right? Because it floats on the waters.
Right.
The question is that a consequence of its design or just mercy of God?
Well, right in 40 days and 40 nights, if I've got that right, there's going to be a lot of water. And I tend to think, even if you had a regular boat, you'd have a hard time keeping that from sinking.
Yeah.
Because
the ark is a miracle in my view. That's what I'm driving at.
Yeah.
It's a miracle. And I love the language later on that says God shut them in. So there's a sense in which God is going to protect this. To me, it is irrelevant. Its dimensions are important because they're included, but it's irrelevant whether it should have floated or shouldn't have floated, whether it was ship-like or cube-like. To me, that's irrelevant because God is going to protect them. This thing is protected by God. He has taken, you remember in creation, he separates the waters from the waters and he creates a dome. And in the midst of that dome, he creates a habitable space for humans to live. And there are waters on either side of that dome, right? Well, in the flood, he is going to shrink that dome so the waters come rushing back in until all that is protected is an ark. To me, it's irrelevant whether the thing would have floated on its own. What's important is that God has asked him to build a structure that God will seal and God will protect. And that's what's important. And that is the image that carries throughout the scriptures to Moses, who is protected by God from the edict of Pharaoh in that ark, to the Ark of the Covenant, in which the law of God is protected from the wickedness of humans. I think it's the basis of inspiration and the belief that we can trust the scriptures. It was in an ark. God protected it. It could not be corrupted by human waters because it was in an ark. And then ultimately Jesus enters an ark too, the grave. It's not, I don't think it's any coincidence that these same letters, these same consonants form the word for coffin.
Yeah, I was going to say that's an interesting thought, because normally for us a coffin is where you put the dead. All the dead were on the outside.
But do you remember Job? He cries out when he's suffering terribly, and he says, "Oh, that I could be buried in the earth until the time of God's wrath is spent, and then return." But no one returns from Sheol. That's what Job says. He wishes he could hide in a coffin until God's wrath was spent.
Yeah.
In some ways, that's exactly the picture of Jesus. He's buried in the earth, and then he's resurrected from the dead. just as Noah comes out of the ark. So I want to focus on the fact that this story, the way that God preserved it for Moses, if he's the one who wrote this down, which tradition says he is, resonates through the rest of Israelite history right up till Jesus. And I think we can get a little too caught up in whether pitch will actually seal out water.
Yeah.
Because God is protecting this ark. Noah's being obedient. God gives him specific instructions on how to build it. But it doesn't succeed because Noah built it right. It succeeds because God shut them in.
Yeah, I don't see how Noah would have had any prior knowledge anyways, other than if it was like divine inspiration. But to know exactly how to build that, and what I was getting to is the actual tools themselves, and to make something that, I mean, no matter how many numbers of animals you saw that were brought onto that ark, I can't even imagine, what it would be like just to have household animals on a boat of any size for any length of time.
Yeah, it's a miracle. Even that movie I was revealing to you, that I was alluding to earlier, they have God or the angels, I think, teach Noah how to make some sort of a sleeping draught, like something that they can. I think it's actually smoke. I think they inhale it, and it puts the animals into some sort of hibernation. That was his solution. So we get caught up really on the science of this thing, but the ark is a miracle.
Yeah.
You're not going to find some rational, scientific, materialistic explanation as to how Noah and these animals survived. Like, I'm a sci-fi guy. This could be like Doctor Who's TARDIS. It might be bigger on the inside. Do you know Doctor Who? Did I lose you?
I know some of it. It's almost like football.
Time and relative dimension in space, for those Whovians who thought I didn't know what it meant. But in his TARDIS is just this tiny little box, but when you step inside, it's huge.
It's a phone booth, right?
Yeah, it's a phone booth.
Yeah.
Well, it's an old police call box. And everybody said, well.
Oh, there you go.
That's
nice.
it.
Yeah.
But it's bigger on the inside. My point is that this is a miracle. And that it's very clear it's a miracle, as creation was. God is miraculously protecting them. And we should remember that waters in Genesis and throughout the scriptures are often used metaphorically to mean chaos and destructiveness and lifelessness. So to protect them from the waters, it may be way more than just a H2O run amok. I mean, the whole world is being filled with water. So God is going to protect them from all kinds of stuff. One thing I hated about that Noah movie is that they let Tubal-Cain break into the ark, and he gets on and stays there for a while, eats some of the animals, and then they have to fight him off. That is a violation of the theology of Genesis, because God was protecting the ark. No Tubal-Cain is going to get in. These are not natural wood walls. This is protected by God. This is, I think, essential. But all the stuff is here. So Shachat, pit, that's related to Sheol. The violence that's here, Hamas, comes on them. The ark, which is also the same consonants for coffin, but means a box. God protects them. That carries on. I mean, this story informs so much theology and so much of the future narrative of the people of God that we can't overestimate it.
Right.
Why 3 decks?
Well, that's 3 is a special number. You can say that right off. I don't really have a good answer.
I don't have a great answer either. It's just curious to me, because I don't think we should be thinking, well, it had to be big enough to house a certain number of. I mean, it was going to be big enough. That was my TARDIS illustration. This is a miracle. Yeah. It's going to be big enough. But I'm still curious about the 3 decks. And part of me wonders if it's something to do with the nature of creation. The earth, the heavens, you mean the sky, and then the heavens where God dwells. If it's meant to be an imitation of those three things being preserved, because that's the nature of creation, being preserved in this building. You remember Paul says that he was taken up to the third heaven. I knew a man who was taken up to the third heaven.
Yeah.
That's the third heaven is where God is. It's paradise. In that thinking. So I'm wondering if the three decks, remember and people might say, well, are you saying he didn't actually build three decks? I'm not saying that. He probably literally built three decks. My question is, why did God want three? And I don't think you should get hung up that it was about space. Yeah. I think everything God has us build, even the temple later, the tabernacle, is symbolic in its dimensions and its size and its specific level. So I think you asked the question, why three? You didn't ask it, I did, but I think a person should ask the question, why three decks? And not get caught up in a materialistic, humanistic answer of the amount of square footage necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right, yeah, because you got an elephant and you got I don't know what else, but something small. I mean, how do you plan for that? So I think it's less important about the contents and more about, a thought came to my mind of where we talked about in the garden, they had man, and then there were cattle, and then there were things that creep the ground.
Yeah.
And that type of distinction came to my mind immediately there at one point, but then I was like, I don't know if I could sustain that kind of discussion.
That's a good thought too, because there are three categories of animals. I hadn't thought of that, but that's perfectly possible too. Like you have creatures that crawl on the ground, you have livestock, and then you have wild animals. And that's a consistent triad of creatures in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2. So you may be right. That might be why you have the three levels. I might like that better than mine.
That came to thought, but I wasn't sure I could sustain it.
Well, again, the point is here, and I want to draw our attention to this. The reason this works is because of verse 22. It doesn't work because Noah's a great engineer. It doesn't work because the ark is sufficient square footage. It doesn't work because pitch is a perfect preservative for wood and will prevent water from coming in. It works because of verse 22. It works because Noah did all that God commanded him. He obeyed.
Right.
This is what distinguishes Noah from the people of the earth, and it is what preserves him. He does what God tells him to do. Now, the reason I point that out is because I've been told many times that if we live the way Jesus called us to live, it would not work. We would become doormats. Wicked people would prosper because we're turning the other cheek and we're praying for our enemies, and justice is not being done on the earth. I've been told it will not work. And I think if you read these dimensions with these specific instructions for the ark, the average human would say that's not going to work. First, it's not going to float. He doesn't even give them rules of buoyancy or what kind of an ark there should be and how much air there should be. He doesn't give them anything they need to make this thing float. This is not going to work. And I think the point is it works because he obeyed. And Jesus' way works if we would trust him. Not because it looks like it should work, but because it will. How do we know? Because God will make it work. And I think that's the flood. God makes this ark work. I think it's somewhat foolish to try to argue that the engineering know-how of Noah, inspired by angels, made it work, because that's one of the solutions. God makes this work. And on the front end, when God gives you an order, it often looks foolish to human wisdom. And when I read the description of how to build this boat, that looks like an insufficient amount of instruction. And so a lot of people have theorized that God helped them, the angels worked with him, that God continued to give him more information, and we are only given a little bit of it, because everybody knows this isn't enough. He's had to build a brick.
Is that the gremlin mentality? The gremlin theology?
I don't know. You'll have to explain gremlin theology to me.
Or the elf mentality, where you go to sleep and you wake up and it's already made for you.
Right. Oh yeah, the shoemaker. Yeah, maybe. But my point is that the reason this works and the reason Noah is preserved to begin with is because he obeys God.
Yeah.
And we have to stop looking at the dimensions and trying to decide whether what God's asking us looks reasonable and workable. We need to start trusting him. And that's what Noah did. Noah didn't have to have any shipbuilding skills. He didn't even have to build a workable ship. All he had to do was obey. God's what makes this work. And I wish there was more emphasis on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the concept that when you compare it to the backdrop of Eden and the obedience compared to disobedience and the outcome of that,
Yeah.
Sin
often looks,
always looking back to that.
Yeah, sin often looks reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Obedience often looks foolish. This is one thing Paul points out right in 1 Corinthians, that the wisdom of God is foolishness to men. And certainly this doesn't look like a very workable shipbuilding model.
No.
Until the Ark encounter,
mm-hmm.
no one had ever tried to use these dimensions to build a ship. Every human engineer knew it wouldn't work. Even at the Ark encounter, they had to make this a boat, they had to use cranes, and they used metal stuff to hold it together, a metal frame, none of which Noah had. But that's irrelevant. Right. This worked because Noah obeyed, and the Lord shut him in.
In defense to the Ark encounter, I'm glad they don't call it Noah's Ark, but they also incorporate some of these ideas that we were talking about. I remember an image of the door, and beside it they had a picture of Luther with the Wittenberg door with that. They also had their quotes from John where it says that I am the door.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wouldn't want to throw the whole thing under the bus. I just think sometimes as Christians, we feel that some aspects of our belief system don't look scientifically viable, and we desperately want to make them scientifically viable. Yeah. But there is such a thing as the whole creation is a miracle. Like, we shouldn't be here. Mm-hmm. Like, the natural state of creation is lifelessness. Yep. So one might say, and should say, that life itself is a miracle that is impossible without God. And the same is true throughout history. And humanity keeps wanting to depend on itself and its own reason and this is the tree of knowledge. But when it comes to obedience, we have to trust the one who asks us, even if the plans don't look very sufficient. Jesus looks like a short-sighted plan. How many times have you heard people say, well, the reason they lived that way is because they thought God was coming right away. If they had known it was going to be 2,000 years, they never would have lived that way. So they always have this idea that trusting God, it's based on ignorance. But really, it's based on faith. You and I can obey Jesus because we trust the one who told us to do this. And Noah could build this ship to these dimensions and believe it would protect him from an enormous flood like something he had never seen because he trusted the one who told him to build it, not because the plans looked good. And that's the difference between Noah and everybody else, as far as I can tell. Verse 22, and it's repeated again in chapter 7, verse 5, when God gives him some additional instructions about clean and unclean animals. It says then in verse 5, and Noah did all the Lord had commanded him. Noah obeys. This is the principal thing that sets him apart in the narrative. He obeys.
Yeah, and even when he's 600 years old.
And even though, as far as we can tell, he doesn't know what clean and unclean animals are.
Right.
There are no sacrifices at this point in the story. No law has been given. That's a detail that would make a lot of sense to Moses' listeners because they had just been given the law of Sinai and they knew what clean and unclean animals were because it was in the law. But Noah wouldn't even know what he was talking about.
Right.
You know, God says, I want 7 of every clean. You can imagine Noah going,
so, I mean, they're not
well,
dirty.
which ones are clean?
Yeah.
But But because Noah's not collecting the animals, God's just sending them. Okay,
Yep.
that's cool.
Get on there. You got your ticket.
Yeah. Noah obeys. That's my point.
Yeah.
Noah obeys. And he doesn't quibble with God about the structure and whether it's really going to work and what kind of materials he should really be using and whether or not this thing's going to have the buoyancy. Like, maybe Noah didn't have the skill for any of that, but he also doesn't quibble about it.
Right.
God's just told him, I'm wiping everything out. I'm going to protect you. Here's what I want you to build.
Right.
And Noah said, okay,
Mm-hmm.
we'll build it. And he did. He obeyed.
Yep. It's as simple as that.
I think it's as simple as that for Noah. It's more complicated for us, obviously, because God is not often as clear to us as he is to Noah.
Right.
You know?
Well,
but he might not have been clear to Noah until this moment.
Yeah. I'm sure he was quite confused where all this water was going to come from.
Yeah. And again, this gets us into the question, to read Genesis as one who believes in inerrancy, do we have to believe that this is a global flood of H2O? And I want to point our people to a resource that will help them to wrestle with that. And I've pointed this out before, as you reminded me, Minister Joe. But this is a book by Tremper Longman III called The Lost World of the Flood, Mythology, Theology, and the Deluge Debate. And it's written from the perspective of a conservative evangelical inerrantist who believes that the Bible is without error and all the prophets and apostles were intending to teach. So it's a great book. He argues, I don't want to give away what he argues this time. I'll be willing to share my own thoughts.
Read the book.
Read that book. It will help you to realize your options. But all human life is going to be destroyed. I don't really know if humans span the globe at this point or if they're in a generalized location. So it's definitely presented as global. It's definitely presented that way. But water doesn't have to mean water in Genesis. In fact, water actually means chaos. So the kind of destruction that's here, it could be a global catastrophe that includes floods, famines, wars, pestilence, all the things you see in Revelation. It could be just a global kind of catastrophe that leads to the end of all life, except those God protects on the ark. It could be that and still be completely consistent with the language of Genesis. It also could be a global flood of actual water, literal water. That is okay too. The simple fact is, God is going to wipe out all life, specifically targeting human life. So if humans are not everywhere, it's not necessarily to destroy everything. But all human life he is targeting, and all the animals that live with them, wherever humans are found, they are going to be wiped out. And he is going to use water to do it. And the flood story is very clear. He's going to use the primordial waters that covered everything at the beginning, that he separated. That's what he's going to use to wipe it out. So he's going to let the floodgates of the heavens open and the floodgates of the deep open. These are the two boundaries he set. That dome in Genesis 1, that's what he's going to release and let rush back over the land. So he's undoing Genesis chapter 3. Genesis 1, day 3, where he separated the seas and let dry ground appear. That's what he's undoing. He is literally working back his creative effort on day 3. And that's what the story says. So whether it was actual water or chaos or some global destructive thing like we see in the fossil records with a meteorite or whatever, however he does it, chaos is taking out all life on Earth. And the only thing that's going to survive is this small group of life that God has selected out of the rest of the life on the earth for preservation, because he's bringing the animals to Noah and he's going to protect them. So That's the story. That's what the prophets have told us.
Mhm.
Does it have to be global? It has to touch every human. And no humans can survive this. So I don't know how far humans went. If they're all over the earth, then it's global. If they're only in a limited location, then I suppose it could be local.
Yeah, but the story, what's reflected in the chapters here too, they'll also reflect the significant amount of water. I mean, how they knew they were over the mountains and
yeah, that picture, and it all depends on what the prophets are trying to say.
Yeah.
But that picture tells us that day 3 is undone
Mm-hmm.
because no dry land remains.
Right.
The chaos has overwhelmed all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point.
Right.
Now, if you were there, what would you have seen? We don't have the answer to that. This is how God wants us to remember it. This is the best way to remember it. But it's the same thing I talked about in Genesis 1. And that might sound maybe to some folks liberal, but it's not liberal at all. It's a question of what the prophets are trying to say. And what is God trying to say? Again, we said this before we started recording, but only a fool believes God told us everything. He told us what we need to know.
It's like that famous line, "You can't handle all of the truth."
Yeah, you can't handle the truth. Yeah. Well, my point is, and I don't know if you want to go on the record, I certainly was raised to think of this as a literal flood of water that covered the whole earth. And it certainly could have been that historically. But what I'm saying is biblically, all it has to be is the chaos destroying all life on earth and covering all the land so that day 3 is undone. That's the picture we're given.
Yeah, and the salvation of Noah and his family.
We're back to day 2, Minister Joe. That's the point. God is backtracking creation to day 2, where you have the waters are separated, but there's no land. That's what he's done. He's undone day 6, 5, 4. And you might say, what, sun, moon, and stars? Well, remember, this is, it's I think, metaphysics. But he's working his way back, and now we're back to day 2, and he's going to start over. That's essentially what we have. He's not worked it back to day 1. He's worked it back to day 2. And even though the sun and the stars are still there, they can't see them. They're trapped in the ark. So once the waters start to recede, we're back on day 3. He sends out the doves and the birds, and they get indications that there are plants. So we're back on day 3. And then the waters recede, they land, they come out of the ark, and creation begins again. Now the animals start to repopulate. Birds in the air, fish in the sea for that matter, but they weren't really judged. They don't get judged till Revelation when God kills them all at the end. I think that's one of the bowls of wrath. But the birds are going to refill the air. The animals are going to repopulate the face of the earth, and so are humans. That's the picture of the flood. And it's inspired. It's inerrant, and it's historical. It really happened. But God has presented it to us in a way we can understand. And that may not always be the same as dragnet history, but it's a way we can understand. So even if you think we hit day 7 before the flood, when God worked everything back to day 2, we haven't really got off day 6. So that's what I want to wrestle around with, is what are the prophets trying to teach us through this? And I do believe it's historical. I just wouldn't be arrogant enough to assume that I could film it.
Right.
I would need more information. I would need to know from God if water is being used as it's being used in Genesis 1, or if it's being used in the way that I would typically use it. If the word flood is a way of speaking about the chaos overwhelming everything, or if it's actually the way I would normally use it. I need more information from God before I could say for sure. I'm fine with either option.
Mhm. Yeah, some people try to talk about it as being a baptism, or and transfer that into uh, kind of the ark of redemption. All these kinds of terms are often used in reference to Noah and the ark. I mean,
Yeah,
even
I
Jesus
can't
talks about it.
remember. Do you remember if in the New Testament the flood is ever used for baptism? I know the Red Sea is. I can think of 1 Corinthians 10, where the Red Sea is used for baptism. But you think about that. I'll do a little search. I can't remember if Noah's flood is ever used biblically in reference to baptism, but it would make sense because baptism, for Jesus' baptism is actually his death.
Mhm.
And when we're baptized, we join him in his death.
Mhm.
That is, I think, the way that Paul most often understands that act. So certainly the people who were baptized in the days of Noah would have been the wicked,
Right, right.
because they were
But
the
yeah,
ones immersed in water.
right, right. Yeah, and I think of the picture. I think it's Dory, Dore, with a little line over it that it's like carvings of. The first time I ever saw a picture of that was the ark was on top of the mountain, and there's like when the water had receded, dead bodies everywhere,
Mm,
laying on the ground, and that was disturbing to me to see it. I'd never seen
yeah,
that,
yeah,
but the realization that life was saved inside the ark.
right. I'm
So
not finding baptism specifically referenced to Noah, but maybe one of our listeners can find a reference to Noah and baptism. The only thing I'm finding is what I had mentioned before, that the Red Sea is used
mhm,
in terms of baptism. But the Red Sea is pretty much a similar metaphor to creation because they've got waters on either side held back by the Spirit of God and they walk through on dry ground. That's what creation is.
right.
And so when God brings the flood, he basically wipes out the dry ground, which means nobody would be able to survive it unless he
Right.
protected them. And
Right.
that's what the ark is. It's
Mhm,
God's protection. And interestingly enough, he has humans build some of it, but the actual effectiveness of what is built is on God.
mhm,
So there is a collaboration going on. God gives law. Noah responds by doing what God has asked him to do. But in the end, God has to actually make it work.
mhm.
And so you have both collaboration and grace.
Yeah, there's it's so revealed, and when we studied Hebrews, it talks about the sacrifice, that there's really the blood is shed, but the forgiveness comes from God.
Right.
The animal is given, its life has been taken, but the forgiveness is really comes from God and forgives us. It's not like you can just do this if there was no God, that and you would find forgiveness. That
Right.
doesn't
Well,
compute.
everything that lives by borrowing from God's life. God shares his life. That's why anything lives. So every animal you kill, you're killing a part of God's life. So Jesus becomes the ultimate realization of that to humanity, that it's actually God that's being sacrificed because everything is his life. So in order for you and me to live, God has to sacrifice him of his own life. That's what he has to do. And that is viscerally shown to us in Jesus. But yeah, it's everything is sourced in God. You know, what are animals? They're just things that live off of the life of God. What are plants? They live off of the life of God. What are humans? We live off of the life of God. Jesus had to be sacrificed before the foundation of the earth because everything lives off of the life of God. We only realized it when Jesus died on the cross, but it was true from before God created anything. And the flood reveals that God doesn't have to sustain the life of the earth. He chooses to. And in the flood, he chooses not to. He chooses to withhold his support from everything except a small number. Yeah. So we'll have to stop there because I'm out of time.
Yeah, right.
Any final words, Minister Joe? And then I want to get to the aftermath of the flood next
Yeah.
time, and the rainbow and the sacrifices and Noah's vineyard and all of that.
So I guess the final statement would be like, if you think you want to ride in the ark, go on with Noah. Let's just say figuratively, then you need to obey and walk with God. Those are, I think, and that goes for any type of relationship or our relationship. So that would be the first thing I think is being taught here, is that to know God is to walk with Him, to
Absolutely.
go on
And to be preserved by God is to trust Him.
mm-hmm.
You and I don't follow Jesus because we look at His teachings and they make sense to us.
Right.
Any more than Noah could have made sense of those instructions to build this ark and think it would have floated.
Right.
You have to
had no
obey.
idea. He had no idea what floated mean, anyways.
There's no way. Yeah, where he lived, in his time, he might have known shipbuilders. I don't know. But
I guess the modern idea would be that idea of an airplane.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what to think? I mean, or to be propelled down the highway at 70 miles an hour, 65 miles an hour.
Humans think we need to be smart enough to protect ourselves from the dangers of the world. Noah knew that only God could protect him, so he needed to obey.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difference. Humans we try to protect ourselves with our knowledge. Noah protected himself with obedience.
Right.
It would be quite a different world if we trusted God enough to obey Him.
Mm-hmm.
Noah did. But of course, he had walked with God.
Right. A modern example may be to think about NASCAR and how that's changed over the years, or football even. The helmets that they used to use, that type of equipment. I mean, even NASCAR now, they wear those big neck braces and.
Right. Yeah, all examples of us trying to improve our resistance.
Right.
Of course, like Jerry Seinfeld said in one of his bits, he wondered why there needed to be a law for helmets. He's like, what are all these activities we're doing that are cracking our skulls? We never consider not doing the things that are cracking our skulls. We just consider protecting ourselves more from the consequences of those choices. And Isn't that a great analogy for sin?
That's right.
We never consider that we should maybe stop sinning. We just keep trying to invent new ways to get away with it.
Yeah, and we can find out in that other areas too.
Yeah. Well, I got to run.
Okay.
But yeah, let's we'll pick up. I know we're going very slow, and the Bible reading is going to be way past Genesis. But do you agree with me, Minister Joe, that these first 11 chapters are worth going through slowly?
Oh yeah, definitely. They're formative. I mean, like I read in the prayer thing this morning, is about Abram's call. You can't. These are all formative. If you ignore them, you're just going to be like passing by.
And notice recurrent words. That's my encouragement. Notice how the word ark first appears here, and notice in what other stories, as you're reading the scriptures, it occurs. And ask yourself what the commonality is. Why is this term being used? And I hope I've dispelled the myth that ark means boat, because it doesn't. It's essentially a box, most directly related to a coffin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we will continue in this conversation. I hope we haven't lost anybody, because it's challenging to think about how to read these stories. My summary is they are historical. These events occurred. Mm-hmm. They are presented to us in a way that we can understand. Mm-hmm. Think about the way that you tell the story of World War II to a child. Mm-hmm. Think about the way that you tell the story of the Civil War to a 6 or 7-year-old. You and I think we're very mature, but in the drop bucket of eternity, even 100 years is nothing. We are a child race, and God needs to present some events to us in terms we will understand. Mm-hmm. And this is a historical event presented to us in a way we will comprehend it. But we would be at the pinnacle of arrogance to believe that we have been given everything. Mm-hmm. God is speaking to children. I know it's insulting, but you and I, Minister Joe, we can barely grasp the simplest concept in the mind of God. So he has to sort of dumb it down for us. And I believe that the Garden of Eden is a dumbed down version of history that we can understand. And I think the flood story is a dumbed down version of history that we can understand. And I think creation is a dumbed down version of the creation of all things that we can understand. I think God is speaking at our level. But we are so arrogant. We think he's speaking at his level and we can understand it. And I think that's just arrogance.
I agree.
And maybe some of our scientific investigations are showing that we don't really know everything. And that would be fine. But this is how God wanted us to remember it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is history. This is history. Even if it's dumbed down, it's still history. And I do think that these are simplified. But they are history. And we would do well to remember what God did to the ancient world. Because he's promised not to do it again. Not to wipe out all life with flood, with chaos, with waters. But he did say this earth is preserved for fire. And that's another image.
Right.
So, yeah. Well, we're going to go.
Okay.
And we'll pick it up again next week. Thank you for joining us.